Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War News Update. First part thereof for the 3rd of April 2024. Let's get to where we normally start. Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply. You can find them in the description to the video below. We have similar personnel losses to what we have seen for the last 4 or 5 days, which is 710. That's somewhere in the kind of mid-range, the mid part of the range. It's not the lowest, not the highest. We have been used to seeing many days over 1,000. So what explains that? And I think something does need to be explained, because 700, as mentioned, is not the highest. And yet we have seen pretty much a record month for equipment losses. Now today, 11 tanks is not the highest, but it's still significant. 18 APVs is fairly hefty. 30 artillery systems, pretty heavy losses in that category. 2 multiple launch rocket systems, 1 anti-aircraft warfare system, 30 vehicles and fuel tanks, and 6 pieces of special equipment. So not the highest day of losses across all the categories, but significant and attritional for the Russians. This will hurt. But in general, over the last 4 or 5 days, we've seen some high numbers of APV losses, armored personnel vehicles, and tank losses indeed. And what I think is going on, because we haven't necessarily seen the high number of troops lost alongside of those, is I think that there are certain areas that are really hot. Novomykhailivka, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, possibly a little bit Terny Torskov, although I think that's even calming down a little bit. But the rest of the front line is fairly stable, even to the point where Krasnohorivka, I don't think has been particularly hot over the last 4 or 5 days. But the southern front line, Velika Novoselka, Robotina, I think the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova and then Svatova to Kremina, I think it is relatively stable. And then even Krinky, I don't think the Russians have been throwing too much at there on the Dnipro River. So I think the Russians have been losing huge numbers of pieces of equipment in just a few areas. Novomykhailivka, as I say, Avdiivka, and to some degree Bakhmut. This has been very painful for them, and they are losing a lot of mechanized equipment, but not necessarily huge numbers of personnel alongside with that. So quite often you see mines, say, disable an infantry fighting vehicle. And I often am amazed that even with the old BMP 1s and 2s, that how survivable they are. I know we often talk about, say, the Bradley infantry fighting vehicle being much more survivable than the BMPs. And that is what's being claimed by the people using them, and evidence has supported that. But even the BMPs, often you see these huge mine explosions, and then everyone gets out. So it totally disables a vehicle, and that's done for. But actually, most of the people inside survive. They get out and run away. And so in those situations, you get a lot of vehicles totally taken out and disabled, but many of the troops surviving. Unless there's like a catastrophic explosion, maybe something like a javelin hitting it. If it's a drone that disables it, or if it's a mine that disables it, quite often many of the people survive. And so I think you're seeing a lot of vehicles getting taken out, people then running off back to where they came from, and these attacks being repelled. But yeah, they're just very attritional on the vehicles. Now, talking about personnel, before we look a little bit more at vehicles, the UK Defence Ministry reports that 2 years after Putin's invasion, its impact is evident, with a record 30% increase in disabilities among Russian men aged 31 to 59 since 2023. So I presume that means in 2024. Now, if that's a 30% increase in the year of 2024 on last year's like-for-like stats, then imagine what 2023 was to 2022 and 22 was to 21. And so you've no doubt got huge increases in disabilities, and that can only really be explained by the war in Ukraine. And so when we look at these stats, we try and look at all the data points concerning the war and the effects of the war, and we see whether what the general staff claim is somewhat true, and the idea that it is very costly for the Russians in terms of personnel loss is no doubt true. Whether those numbers are exact or even close to being exact, I think with the personnel stats, as I keep saying, you're going to have the largest, I guess, amount of elbow room, given largest scope for error, given there's a lot of estimation in this personnel stats compared to all the other ones, which you have visual confirmation of much more readily. But I think then when you look at the idea that there are huge disability statistics now for the Russians in fighting age men, then you're thinking, yeah, whatever the number actually is, Russia is just losing a lot of human beings in their war efforts. Now, when it comes to the vehicles, Richard Vareka from War Spotting says the numbers keep going up. Russia is now visually confirmed to have lost at least 262 infantry fighting vehicles in March 2024 alone. That's more than any of the last 17 months. So it's the highest month of losses for infantry fighting vehicles. So then when we go back to look at what the not the ISAF, the General Staff are claiming, and we see these high numbers on consistently across, say, for example, March, and we go to War Spotting, we say, right, okay, this all adds up, and then we go to Andrew Perpetua, that yesterday was a record-breaking day for losses in a 24-hour period. Okay, they might not all have been lost yesterday. The videos were published yesterday, but you get the point. March has been incredibly costly for the Russians. He then says, Richard Vareka, I want to draw attention to the graph below. The Russian tank to Russian infantry fighting vehicle loss ratio was pretty stable for the first 24 months of the war at around 1 to 1.85. So for every one tank lost, you had 1.185 on average infantry fighting vehicles lost. That has shot up in this month to 1 to 3.2. One tank to 3.2 infantry fighting vehicles. Now that's incredible. It shows that one assumes that the tank losses have been fairly stable, but the infantry fighting vehicles have been just the losses have been extortionate this month. I don't know why this is, but I wonder if it's related to the massive failed Russian attack 2 days ago, where almost 30 Russian tanks and 12 IFVs got cut to bits. Now he tries to explain it because that's counterintuitive, because he's like, they used loads of tanks, so you'd expect there to be low tank losses and high IFV losses. But he goes on, and I don't know whether he just got his stats in a twist there and then tried to justify it. But he then says what I was saying is that they were keeping their tanks for just one attack and then lost a bunch on that one attack. But generally, you don't see high uses of tanks anymore. And actually, this is something that seems to be borne out. I talked about this the other day. Andrew Perpetua in his live stream said you don't have times at the moment where most attacks are like three vehicles, like a couple of IFVs and maybe a tank, or three IFVs. And actually, we don't see these huge attacks like we saw a couple of days ago at Tonyenko, and like we've seen at Novomykhailivka. It turns out there's another huge attack that seems to have been very costly for the Russians. So whatever is going on, it seems that Russia is losing a lot of equipment, and that is very challenging for the Russians going forward. You would think that at some point they are going to run out of these vehicles. The deep stockpiles are going to be exhausted. They won't be able to cannibalize many more. Is this why we're seeing more and more golf carts being used in attacks? I don't know. War Monitor here says Ukrainian brigades defending Novomykhailivka, where battles are still ongoing in the month of March, destroyed 32 tanks and 43 armoured vehicles. So this is a very high tank to armoured vehicle ratio there, just in Novomykhailivka. So that kind of almost goes against this graph. But then, if that happened in Novomykhailivka, then to explain the actual data here for the very high IFV to tank ratio, you would have to have other places on the front line losing phenomenal amounts of IFV. So, again, it's understanding this in context. But anyway, he's suggesting that Novomykhailivka has been really expensive for the Russians in the month of March. Then, when you look at Andrew Perpetua's live stream last night, he talked about getting some not high res, this is low res satellite imagery of just north of Novomykhailivka. And he says, you only have to look at this. These are all vehicles. Some of them are just unknown because the low res is not good enough to work out what the vehicle is that's been destroyed. Some of them are definable, and then you've got a few others that in the distance. He said another video came out that could work out these, and then going back over here, he thinks there are more Russian vehicles over here. But what he wants to do is afford a high res piece of satellite imagery to cover this whole area. And then he'd be able to definitely work that out. It's about $400, I think, for that kind of area. So, if you can help Andrew Perpetua out with fundraising, please go to his map here has click if you want to support the map, and that's a way of supporting his ability to find out more information. Data is really important. It underwrites how we understand this war. But nonetheless, just Novomykolivka is another area of huge Russian losses, as we have seen in the Tonyenka area. This will be here. You've got a lot of kit lost here. Purple might be, yeah, it doesn't know which side it belongs to, but it's likely Russian. And then if you go back days, no doubt you're going to see even more. But
Look at you. An absolute legend. Not you, Frank.
Sorry, random advert coming through on that tab for some reason. Anyway, point being that Tonyenka, there are a lot of losses for the Russians there, as well as Novomykolivka further down to the south. So again, it's about building up this picture as to whether these figures are accurate or not. What else can I show you? Well, I thought this was an interesting evolution again of drone usage. Here we have a Ukrainian Ratel S ground kamikaze drone, so UGV. This is driving along the ground like a remote controlled car and being used as essentially a moving kamikaze explosive. In this case, it takes out a bridge or makes the bridge less usable. I mean, it doesn't look particularly usable as it is. This is near Bakhmut by all accounts, and it drives down there, falls down that hole, right, which is already a hole in the bridge, and then explodes, thus I think rendering the bridge even less stable. I don't know, there's no imagery of it afterwards. You do see a big explosion. Unfortunately, that's what gets my videos restricted, so I won't show you that, but you can check all these videos on by clicking on the links in the description below. But interesting use of a drone there. Then we have Andrew Perpetua saying, look how many drones are attacking simultaneously. And he has a few marked out here on that bit of still imagery where I think there's 6 drones, I think, marked out attacking at once there. And I don't know if there are multiple drones in each of those red areas. It might be, I don't know. But anyway, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then 6 possibly there. And he says, I've seen 8, 10, 12 drones attack at the same time before. I don't see how infantry can survive that. There is nothing you can do, especially when the drones carry different munitions. Tear gas, thermobaric, incendiary, high explosive, dual purpose. The drones are prepared for anything. You have 1 drone dropping tear gas into a hole and like 4 drones overhead with high explosive charges and shrapnel bombs. And if the gas doesn't work, you have a dive bomber ready with the thermobaric and incendiary bombs. Just incredible. So and I don't know that he's referring to any particular side here. I think this is Azov regiment. So this is footage coming from the Ukrainians, but I assume this might be the case for both sides, where the skies are just full of drones, and it just must be horrific to be an infantryman in a trench network like this, or trench dugout, or just out in the open, just having to operate in these conditions. Absolutely horrific. I'm sure the PTSD for some of these guys when they hear buzzing sounds will be pretty horrendous. Train derailment in Moscow. 10 wagons have tipped over, says Tim White. Officials say the banks washed away and the rails slipped. I don't know that I can see any washing away of banks there, but nonetheless, real problem for the Russians there. No Russia on fire imagery today, as there sometimes is. Right, we'll move on to distance munitions. 100% strike rate on knocking down drones, but 0% on stopping missiles. This is fairly typical. Not many drones being sent, only 4, and then being shot down, all of them being shot down. But they are sending in the Russians S-300 surface-to-air missile systems in their ground attack mode, taking a ballistic trajectory that are very difficult to shoot down unless you've got Patriots or possibly SAMP-T. But anyway, 3 hits from S-300s. I believe Dnipro was hit yesterday. We'll come on to that in a second. According to Ukrainian intelligence, Russia currently has about 950 high-precision missiles with a range of more than 350 kilometers. I talked about there being a count of around 750 yesterday, and we totted up the different types. This is another analysis saying 950, stated by Vadim Skibitsky, representative of Defense Intelligence of Ukraine. Quote, we predict that Russians will be able to conduct several more massive strikes, 2 to 3 massive attacks, and then will be forced to take a break again to accumulate missiles and Shaheeds. However, some localized shelling may continue. But it's exactly the same as I stated yesterday. So even if you put another 200 long-range missiles on that, and it depends how you tot up things like surface-to-air missiles, and whether you include those in some of these counts, but nonetheless, 950 missiles for Russia is not a lot of missiles, even if it's 200 more than what was claimed yesterday. And who knows which of those numbers is correct. That's not enough for Russia to conduct multiple campaigns at the same time. So they are exhausting their stockpiles on Ukraine and leaving themselves unable to commit to any other major war. Which is why I keep saying things like, if Poland were to go to war with Russia in a conventional war, nukes aside, Poland would win, certainly in a land war. Just the Russians are exhausting themselves on Ukraine. I think that's a dangerous game for the Russians to play. Now, there is imagery coming out of as Jay Kiev says, of an attack on Dnipro yesterday, next to a school, it seems. So Russians just tried to massacre an entirely full school with ballistic missiles in the city of Dnipro in the middle of the school day. All kids had just run to the bomb shelter. There were only 5 casualties. Are Russians human, he states, from the imagery coming out from inside a school there. Luckily, the classrooms had been emptied. But yeah, pretty horrific to see schools on a school day. If they're not being targeted, they're now being damaged and hit one way or the other by these missiles. This is what war looks like when it's prosecuted unfairly by an aggressive nation who has no consideration for human life, either their own soldiers or those of Ukrainian civilians. It is despicable, and that is why I'm doing what I'm doing, saying what I'm saying, to try and keep this in the public consciousness. Right, at the same time, here we have some imagery coming out of one of Ukraine's thermal power stations. That is the control room. So Ukraine now lacking air defense, Russians are just destroying the country's power grid to force a majority of the population into Europe, massacre those that remain, and then call it Russia. Obviously, Jan Kiev is very rhetorical with what he says and how he says it. But, this is a control room of a power plant, previously supplying electricity to 700,000 people, now in ruins. That is what Russia is doing, and they are slowly turning the screw, it seems, on the energy network in a way that they were less able to do 2 winters ago. So it's interesting. Reportedly, the wreckage of the drone that hit in Tatarstan this morning, it looks like a UJ-22 drone. It's probably a modified version, since the original version had a range of 800 kilometers, and these strikes were over 1,200 kilometers. So the wreckage being pulled out of that oil refinery attack in Tatarstan, or from the attack on the Shaheed or Jiran factory. The UJ-22 looks like a small plane. Some people were claiming yesterday, and it still could be the case, that it wasn't the UJ-22. It was actually a plane that's been modified to become a drone. The UJ-22 is as mentioned here by Special Ops magazine, a versatile drone for military operations. So just some of the capabilities of this. Versatile drone, primarily intended for military purposes. Scaled down aircraft is capable of autonomous operation or remote control from a command center with a range of up to 100 kilometers. The drone's maximum flight range extends to 800 kilometers, and possibly even more now, enabling it to conduct long-range missions effectively. Boasts advanced sensors, cameras, and communication systems, allowing it to undertake various tasks including reconnaissance, surveillance, and target acquisition, and even offensive missions. The drone is equally adept at performing intelligence operations, search and rescue, and supporting the military, police, and rescue services. In addition to carrying ammunition, it can accommodate a camera and optoelectronics station as part of its payload. So anyway, whack that full of explosives and fly into a target, and that's potentially what happened. It might not be the UJ-22. People are still speculating as to what it was that hit those two targets so far from the Ukrainian front lines. Now, here we've got an Iskander missile being disposed of, so it was unexploded, hit somewhere, I don't know where, but I just want to show you what the crater looks like. So when these Iskander missiles are hitting into cities, this is the damage that these things can do. These are big explosive. These are ballistic missiles if it's the Iskander M that are very difficult to shoot down, and they cause a lot of pain and consternation for the Ukrainians. On the other hand, last night, Kursk region, something was burning and was hit. Don't know any details, but there are thoughts that it was an ammunition depot as it was popping off. Yep, something was hit in Russia. Who knows exactly what. Now, talking about these kind of strikes in general, Zelensky said in March alone, Russian terrorists used over 400 missiles of various types, 600 Shahed drones, and over 3,000 guided aerial bombs. It's that last one that I think is particularly problematic for the Ukrainians, because there appears to be virtually nothing the Ukrainians can do about these Russian guided glide bombs, other than bring Patriot systems to the front, shoot down those airframes, but then lose some Patriot launchers in so doing, potentially. The terror is wreaking havoc on cities and villages throughout Ukraine, says the president, and Russia is particularly relentless in bombarding frontline and border areas. Yep, it's those 3,000, 700 in 1 week. Actually, the 3,000 in a month leaves you more than 700 in a week. Okay, our city of over 1 million people, Kharkiv, has been subjected to missile and drone strikes since the full-scale war began. Recently, Russian terrorists also began to use aerial bombs against Kharkiv. I'm going to be speaking to Anastasia Paraskova today at 5 o'clock UK time, and I was due to speak to her a couple of Fridays ago, but the Ukrainians suffered in Kharkiv, particularly as the Russians hammered it and it lost power, and so we were unable to connect. Going to try today. City sees daily humiliation and pain as well as daily losses. Critical infrastructure has been destroyed and ordinary residential buildings are being demolished on a daily basis. None of this will be possible when Ukraine receives reliable air defense systems capable of saving lives and restoring security to our cities. Interesting use of the word reliable there. Maybe that means that some air defense systems are unreliable, maybe some of the older ones. Patriots in the hands of Ukrainians have demonstrated that all forms of Russian terror can be defeated. It's very clear what he wants. Patriots is what he wants. This is what our Kharkiv, as well as all of our cities and communities, require right now as Russian strikes threaten their lives. And then finally here, we have, I think this is super important, and goodness me, the French just seem to be turning up, like rhetorically, consistently, and they are starting to put their money and their military where their mouth is. And this is fantastic news for Ukraine and Ukraine support. So here we have France supports Ukraine's strikes on Russian oil refineries. French Foreign Minister Stéphane Séjourné has called them legitimate defense. This is in direct contravention to what the Americans have recently said and also repeated. So Antony Blinken said this in interesting. I wonder if he said this in the same conference, because Antony Blinken was in Paris next to Séjourné talking about how the US does not support or assist with Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil refineries. And I was speaking to Jonathan Fink yesterday. Please go and check out my interview on Silicon Curtain. And I proposed again the economic argument that the US doesn't want the cost of crude or refined products to go up because maybe it will affect the global prices. And with Biden having an election coming up in November, it could be that. Jonathan, afterwards, we were having a chat about this, and he said he's spoken to a number of people in pretty decent positions that he's interviewed. He's reached back out to them and said, look, what's going on with the US talking this talk? Why is it that the US is saying that Ukraine shouldn't strike these refineries? And actually, though that economic argument may be a component, the main argument is the escalation argument. And the US is still in this position whereby there seems to be this window of optimal warfare that goes on with Ukraine and Russia, and US support and allied support for Ukraine getting to this particular sweet spot level, but they're still worried that if you go over that level, that nukes will be called into action. They are still worried about escalation after all this time. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking, is this particular to the? I'm not trying to get, I always say this. I'm not trying to get Biden off the hook, and I'm only saying this because I was watching Turning Point, the series on the Cold War on Netflix, and something. There's a number of things that really like shouted to me, and one of them, well, there were several points where escalation was a hot topic actually for both sides, like historically through the war, but particularly for the Americans. And this included Reagan, and they were talking about Reagan, although we talk about would Republicans, you know, do this if Reagan was still in charge. And we talk about Mike Johnson as not a Reagan Republican, he's a MAGA Republican. Actually, Reagan would have done very, very different things. But actually, Reagan apparently, so the documentary was saying, was really afraid of war and was quite careful about escalation, as you would be. And I think that's a theme you see going through all American administrations since the Second World War. For obvious reasons, they were petrified of Russian nuclear attacks to the point where they actually overestimated Russia's capability, and Russia sold them a lie many times about how many nukes they actually had. And it turns out that the US had way more than Russia for most of that Cold War period. And then it did change, and Russia had more than America. But where there were times where they were afraid of escalation, it turns out that they were being hoodwinked by the Russians because they did this amazing disinformation campaign. Goodness me, isn't this history repeating itself? Anyway, I advise anyone go and watch Turning Point. But I think the US has a long history of having de-escalation or escalation at the center of its doctrine and its approach and its geopolitical and diplomatic approach to dealing with Russia. And we are, I think, seeing that now with the Biden administration, and we can argue whether that is the right approach or not. I mean, but I think it's an American approach for obvious reasons, because you can't make a mistake when it comes to mutual assured destruction, right? And so, better to be cautious and de-escalatory than escalatory. And I guess that's where people like Jake Sullivan, particularly as part of the Biden administration, are at the moment. The problem is that could lead to Ukraine losing, and it's costing tens of thousands of lives. And I don't think those red lines are there as much as the US is worried. And I think that their sweet spot box could be lifted up to here. And I think you could send in F-16. You could help. You could justify. You could openly say, well, Ukraine need to hit what they need to hit in order to do what they need to do to win the war. And I don't think Russia's going to use nukes. So I think that the Biden administration is being too cautious. But what I'm trying to do is explain that in the context of that's actually how the American administrations have often been, because of the history of the Cold War, because freaking nukes, right? Anyway, I would criticize the Biden administration and possibly in certain individuals like Jake Sullivan in there for just misreading, I think, the present conflict and misreading the red lines and how Russia has not reacted to any of the red lines in the way that they might have. Because this is the same argument we had for M777s at the beginning, and then HIMARS, and then this, and then that, and then F-16s. And now it's oil refineries. Just, yeah, let Ukraine do what they do. But then you still have that Putin paradox, as I call it, which is the better Ukraine do, the more likely it is that that Putin will do something nuts. Anyway, moving on to other bits and pieces. Let me know what you think, guys. Moving on to other bits and pieces. Sergei Narishkin has said that the information on the preparation of the terrorist attack, so the Crocus City Hall, transmitted by the US, did not make it possible to identify all those who could have participated in the attack on Crocus. So this is the Russians saying that, well, the US gave us intel, it's such a weird scenario because it's like the Russians almost implicitly admitting that their intel was crap, saying, well, we had no intel it was going to happen, but but the US told us, and it turns out that the Iranians had warned us as well. And then the US warned us, and then they're criticizing the US for saying, well, they gave us information, but it was too vague. Couldn't do enough. Even though the US said, I think they even hinted maybe the Crocus City Hall, but certainly venues. According to head of Russian intelligence service, a counterterrorism information exchange channel between Russia and the US continues to operate, but in a limited mode, and the data on the terrorist attack transmitted by Washington was too broad. Like, yeah, it's your fault. Yeah, well, so what are you doing now blaming the US for the terrorist attack still, the CIA and Ukraine? And all the info's coming in and like I said before, Russia are arresting Tajiks, saying, well, they are funding this IS attack. And then they've arrested IS people, and IS has said it was us, and then they presented video evidence to suggest 100% it was IS. And still, given all of this stuff, the Russians are still saying, but it was the Ukrainians. But it was the CIA. And of course, they're just playing to their domestic audience. I don't think they genuinely believe that at all. Right. Going on to. I hate it when this happens. Right. Yes, it's turned up again. Brilliant, because I've highlighted parts of this. Excellent. Thank you. Right. So, big article in The Guardian today saying no choice, and this has gone quite viral. No choice, quote, no choice. Ukraine eyes Kerch Bridge in Crimea for drone attack. Ooh, so we've expected this, and we know that the Russians will lose a Kerch Bridge at some point, or at least the Ukrainians are going to target it again. They have done previously. They're just waiting for the right, I guess, munitions to do so. Senior officials from Ukraine's HUR military intelligence service indicate it is plotting a third attempt on the bridge after two previous attempts to blow it up, claiming its destruction is, quote, inevitable. How any Ukrainian attack would unfold is unclear, and there are serious doubts as to whether the HUI is capable of pulling off a special operation such as against such a well-defended and obvious target. Russia has taken extensive measures to protect the bridge, strengthening anti-aircraft defenses and deploying a target barge as a decoy for incoming guided missiles. They've also sunk a load of ships, their ferries, around it to make it difficult for, I guess, submarine drones or whatever to get there. So it is going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to blow up the bridge. There's no doubt about that. They did an amazing job with what seems to be that lorry bomb and all those hexagen explosives inside the cellophane rolls that they'd taken this circuitous route, or not circuitous, is the winding route through, I think, was it through Georgia and then into Russia, and then from Russia into occupied territories and onto the Crimean, or no, through probably Rostov and then onto Crimean Bridge, and then bang. And now Russia have learned their lesson. So the HUR thinks it can disable the bridge soon. Quote, we will do it in the first half of 2024, one official told The Guardian, adding that Kirill Budanov, the head of the main directorate of intelligence, already had, quote, most of the means to carry out this goal. He was following a plan approved by Ukraine's President Zelensky to, quote, minimize Russia's naval presence in the Black Sea. And it turns out that even though it's kind of up and running, the Kerch Bridge, that heavy military traffic is not going over the Kerch Bridge, and it is being taken to Crimea via other routes, such as ferries and whatnot. If the bridge were permanently compromised, Moscow would be forced to transport military supplies by road through occupied southern Ukraine. The route would go via Kherson and Zaporizhia provinces, which Russia partly captured in spring 2022. Ukrainian officials believe this would significantly impair the Kremlin's ability to carry out offensives at a time when its ground forces are advancing. The officials indicated that Western weapons would allow Ukraine to destroy the bridge more speedily, and Zelensky has repeatedly asked Berlin for its long-range Taurus system. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz has so far refused, arguing that this would be tantamount to the country taking a direct role in a war with Russia, a dangerous escalation. And we get back to arguments of escalation. Now, if you look at this map of Crimea here, the Kerch Bridge, we know that the Russians are very close to finishing their railway that comes in from the area from Rostov-on-Don. Rostov-on-Don's not here. This is Krasnodar. Rostov-on-Don up here, down through Taganrog to Mariupol and Berdyansk. So that railway is almost complete, and that will allow there to be an alternative to the Kerch Bridge. However, I imagine the Ukrainians are just lining up, getting themselves ready for that bridge to be opened, and then absolutely hammer aspects of that bridge. I would assume that's what I would do. At the end of the article is quite poignant. Timkov compared Ukraine to a patient on life support in desperate need of further assistance. Quote, "We are attached to a drip. We have enough drugs to stay alive, but if the West wants us to win, we need the full treatment," he said. "Otherwise, we fall down." Nice bit of metaphor going on there. Now, Politico has an article, another fairly sizable article that's also particularly interesting, talking about how indeed Ukraine is on life support and at a great risk of having its front lines collapse. So let's dip into this. Essentially, everything now depends on where Russia will decide to target its strength in an offensive that's expected to launch this summer. In a pre-offensive pummeling stretching from Kharkiv to Sumy in the north to Odessa in the south, Russia's missile and drone strikes have widely surged in recent weeks, targeting infrastructure and making it hard to guess where it will mount its major push. And according to high-ranking Ukrainian military officers who served under Zaluzhny, the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces until he was replaced in February, the military picture is grim. The officers said there's a great risk of the front lines collapsing wherever Russian generals decide to focus their offensive. I was talking about this recently. Andrew Pepech is talking about this on his live stream about where Russia would attack and focus, or will they spread their focus as they have done over the past, over most of the war. They very rarely focused on one place particularly. Yes, you could argue Bakhmut, and that was doing their meat wave attacks using convicts and Wagner. But now, other than that, it's been kind of like, let's try and attack sort of everywhere. And now we've got, as I've mentioned many times, Novomykhailivka, Krasnohorivka, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, Terny, as your main areas. Will they pick one of those? And if they do, the idea is that if they did pick one and then hammer it with aerial aviation, guided glide bombs, and then huge amounts of personnel and equipment, they could force the Ukrainians to collapse in one particular place. Moreover, thanks to a much greater weight in numbers. So, and in fact, if you go back to Avdiivka, where they did surge there, but then you look at the same time, they were sort of surging in Terny, and they were surging in Novomykhailivka and Krasnohorivka and Marinka. Imagine if they just left all those areas with kind of skeleton crews and pulled all their resources into Avdiivka, what they might have achieved. So moreover, thanks to a much greater weight in numbers and the guided aerial bombs that have been smashing Ukrainian positions for weeks, Russia will likely be able to, quote, penetrate the front line and to crash it in some parts, they said. They spoke on the condition of anonymity to speak freely. Quote, "There's nothing that can help Ukraine now because there are no serious technologies able to compensate Ukraine for the large mass of troops Russia is likely to hurl at us. We don't have those technologies and the West doesn't have them as well in sufficient numbers," one of the top-ranking military sources told Politico. I would disagree. I say if they had an obscene amount of Patriots air defense systems, then you would stop Russian VKS operating and dropping those bombs. And that means you would just have masses of troops and infantry, masses of troops and equipment that could be taken out with huge barrages of artillery. So if Ukraine had lots of Patriots and lots of artillery and ammunition, particularly including cluster munition and HIMARS and stuff, you can easily, like conceptually, easily stop that. But the first thing is to stop the airframes from operating. So this is the importance of Patriots, which is why Zelensky's talking about that. So I disagree with these military generals that have far more skill, intelligence, and wit and wisdom of military matters than I do. Who knew? According to him, it is only Ukrainian grit and resilience as well as errors by Russian commanders that may now alter the grim dynamics. Mistakes like the one made on Saturday when Russia launched one of its largest tank assaults on Ukrainian positions since its full-scale invasion began, only to have a column smashed by Ukraine's 25th Brigade, which took out a dozen tanks and 8 infantry fighting vehicles, a third of the column's strength. However, the high-ranking Ukrainian officers reminded that relying on Russian errors is not a strategy. And they were bitter about the missteps they say hamstrung Ukraine's resistance from the start, missteps made by both the West and Ukraine. They were also scathing about Western foot dragging, saying supplies and weapon systems came too late and in insufficient numbers to make the difference they otherwise could have. In fact, there's talk about, it goes on to talk about it here, so we'll go into that. Don't believe the hype about them just throwing troops at the meat into the meat grinder to be slaughtered, he added. They do that too, of course, maximizing even more the impact of their superior numbers, but they also learn and refine. The officers said the shoulder-fired anti-tank missile supplied by UK and US in the first weeks of the invasion came in time, helping them save Kiev, and so too did the HIMARS, the light multiple launch rocket systems, which are used to great effect, enabling them to push Russia out of Kherson in November 2022. Quote, but often we just don't get the weapon systems at the time we need them. They come when they're no longer relevant, another senior officer said, citing the F-16 fighter jets as an example. A dozen or so F-16s are expected to be operational this summer after basic pilot training has been completed. Quote, every weapon has its own right time. F-16s were needed in 2023. They won't be right for 2024, he said. Oof. And that's because, according to the officer, Russia is ready to counter them. I'd agree with this, actually. I think that they are getting ready to hammer those air bases, which is why I think the F-16 should be kept in NATO air bases to the side of Ukraine and then flown into Ukraine just to take off from a Ukrainian air base. So you fly them in, refuel, take off from there, hit Russian targets, and then fly back and then land them in NATO. That's how I do it. And that's because, according to his officer, Russia is ready to counter them. In the last few months, we started to notice missiles being fired by the Russians from Jankoy in northern Crimea. But, and this is super interesting here, but without the explosive warheads, we couldn't understand what they were doing, and then we figured it out. They're range finding, he said. The officer explained that Russia's been calculating where best to deploy its S-400 missile and radar systems in order to maximise the area they can cover to target the F-16s, keeping them away from the front lines and Russia's logistical hub. So firing basically dud missiles, so keeping the expense low, just firing the missile without the warhead, finding out how far they can get, and saying, right, okay, so if F-16s come into this area, we can hit them with these S-400s, so on and so forth. Lots more in that article. Really good article there from Politico. Interesting stuff. Moving on, the Ukrainian former president Petro Poroshenko said he intends to participate in the next presidential elections. Interesting. So that could throw into the mix some interesting political dynamics there. An underground school in Kharkiv. I'm just going to leave you with this. This is a school that will start working this school year. It's 6 meters underground, constructed like a bomb shelter, and the Russian military attacks Kharkiv and the region almost every day. This is a way to keep the kids safe. So here we have an underground school, and of course that's what Ukraine has to do to try and keep its society working, keep its school children educated. It's so important. This, what you don't want is entire cohorts, like consistent years of cohorts receiving no education or very poor education, and then being psychologically affected through social and familial issues that arise out of enduring a war, and then having 18, 19, 20-year-olds, when they grow up to those ages, being lacking in skills and being psychologically scarred and being less employable. It's so important that Ukraine looks after its children in all the ways it needs to, educationally and socially and psychologically. And that is such a massive challenge for Ukraine. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate your support. It's another long one today. Lots of news and analysis to go through. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.